Welcome to Science Pearls, and today we'll be covering a study examining cultural segregation in the social networks of high school students. It's no secret that in many countries, schools are often segregated by wealth, leading to disparities in academic success. We also know that children are highly influenced by their peer groups when it comes to their academic achievement, meaning that people tend to perform about as well as their friends. This study, published in the Public Library of Science, used social media information from more than 36,000 students in Russia. Specifically, they looked at the connections between students and what schools they went to in order to determine the patterns of connectedness between schools. In short, they were trying to see how many connections there were between the different schools. The study used a list from the Russian government in order to identify all of the schools in the area they were studying, which included 628 schools. They removed 2 schools with an identical name to prevent confusion in determining whether or not a connection was within or between those schools. In order to measure schools' performance, they used testing data made available on the School of St. Petersburg website. Performance on a nationwide standardized test. For the social media data, they used data from VK, which is basically a Russian version of Facebook. The data they used were where the individuals were going to school and a list of their friends. They excluded people who listed more than one high school and people who had no friends who went to the same school that they did. This was in order to weed out people who might be lying about where they actually went to school. They also used data from a Russian real estate website in order to assess the general wealth of a neighborhood by measuring the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. In building their connection network, the researchers used each friendship connection between 2 students going to different schools as one connection between those schools, meaning they did not analyze the data at the level of the students. Instead, they only measured the number of connections between schools. Overall, they found that the closer 2 schools are geographically, the more likely they are to be connected to each other. This pattern was non-linear, with a steep drop-off within a short distance and a gradual decline following that. This makes sense, as people tend to know people who live closer to them. But this was not the only trend they found. The researchers also found that high-performing schools tend to be connected to each other and to have more connections overall. This means that beyond proximity, students are more likely to be connected to students in other schools with a similar level of performance. This implies some degree of academic segregation, where high-performing schools are socially connected to each other and have more connections to other schools than lower-performing schools do. So what does this mean? Well, it's very difficult to draw many conclusions from this data beyond what the researchers highlighted. There are several possible explanations for why these schools might be more connected. Wealthy families might tend to connect to each other more for various reasons, such as spending more time traveling for extracurriculars. Schools might be performing better due to an increase in diversity of thought. Some research has shown that interacting with a diverse group of people can improve academic performance by exposing an individual to multiple systems of thought. Wealthier schools might have more money for more extracurricular travel. High-performing students could behave differently online, leading them to have more connections online. Ultimately, we don't know if the connections are leading to an increase in performance or the other way around, or if perhaps some other factor such as wealth is at play. What we do know, however, is that for whatever reason, the lack of connections between the high-performing and the low-performing schools means that an academic and potentially a wealth segregation is happening online and is not isolated to in-person interactions. This ultimately means that within these networks, there's significant potential for cultural divides between high and low performing schools, which could certainly lead to continued social segregation into adulthood. It's also important to note that this study happened in Russia, so while there's no reason to believe that this pattern isn't true for other countries, there still needs to be studies in other countries to see if the pattern remains. Thank you for tuning into Science Proles. I hope you like the content, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button below if you want to stay up to date with the latest research.